Hello everyone, it's Rose, and today we're going to continue with the reading of Chapter 4 of the Magnate's Manifesto. This is a Harlequin Presents novel by Jennifer Hayward. If you are just tuning into this series now, you can watch chapters 1 to 3 in the playlist that I'm linking in the little eye at the top right corner of your screen. If you just want to be able to come back to this playlist at some time, or for those of you who are watching this after I have recorded the whole book or more chapters of the book and you want to catch later chapters, I'll also link that playlist at the very end of this video, so that you can just click on it and you can pick which chapter you want to listen to next. All right, so let's get into Chapter 4. The Magnate's Manifesto, Chapter 4. Bailey woke up full of piss and vinegar, as her mother would have said, ready to attack the presentation, slot in her yoga idea, and rehearse it until it sparkled. She pulled on shorts and a knit top, her mouth curving at the thought of her colorful mother. She may have limited her exposure to the family who'd turned her out when she'd started dancing, stripping, as her father had bitingly referred to it, but it didn't mean she didn't have some good memories of her childhood. She'd often spent Saturdays sitting on one of the worn, ripped leather chairs in her mother's hair salon, rather than face the uncertain mood of her father, who could be even-keeled if he hadn't drunk too much that day, or downright mean if he had. She'd finish her homework, then sit fascinated as her mother's less-than-polished clientele talked about men, other women in an often catty fashion, and anything else on their mind they felt needed to be aired. Eye-opening and illuminating conversation for a 10-year-old, to be certain. She'd made sure she didn't miss one juicy detail. Unfortunately, the glow hadn't lasted. As she'd gotten older, it was her mother's quietness she'd noticed. How she would listen but not talk much, smile but not really. And she'd wondered if her mother knew what she knew, that her husband was not only a violent drunk who couldn't get over the loss of his high school football glory, but he'd also been unfaithful to her while on the road selling vacuum cleaners across the state. Bailey had answered one too many phone calls at home while her mother was working from a supposed customer named Janine, not to put two and two together when her father subsequently ordered her out of the room and a hushed conversation ensued. As a teenager, the glow had disappeared completely. What did it matter if her mother treated her to hot rollers on Saturday if on Monday the clothes you wore to school were falling apart, when no one wanted to hang out with you because you were the epitome of poor uncool? The memories floated in the window of her beautiful Cap Ferrat suite, in blinding contrast to her current circumstances. She pressed her lips together, secured her hair in an elegant pile on top of her head, a hairstyle her mother would have called hoity-toity, then made her way downstairs to join David and Jared in the breakfast room. The two men were discussing a trip into Nice to visit an art gallery. David stood, brushed a kiss across both of her cheeks, and held a chair out for her. "Would you like to come with us, ma chère? The Chagalls are phenomenal." "It's tempting," she responded, taking a seat. "But no thank you. I have work to do." Jared murmured a greeting. She slid him a wary glance as she reached for the coffee pot. He was freshly shaven and annoyingly edible in a pair of jeans and a t-shirt that hugged his muscular chest and shoulders in all the right places, and more relaxed this morning if the softer edges of his face were anything to go by. She poured herself a full cup of the strong French brew. He'd probably been up at 5 doing his Buddhist meditation thing. Rumor had it he'd spent 3 months as a college dropout in India, studying with a Zen master, and practiced it regularly. She'd even heard some of the engineers moan that Jared was on another tangent with his simplicity-inspired principles, and they might never leave the lab with an end product if he didn't back off. She removed her gaze from all that drool-inducing masculinity and focused on buttering a croissant. Rule number 1 when it came to her new strategy of handling Jared: no drooling at all. Ignore him completely. He and David took off to Nice in one of the Frenchman's vintage sports cars. Seduced by the spray of the waves and the chance to be outdoors, Bailey settled herself on one of the terraces overlooking the ocean, slid on some sunscreen, and set to work building her slides. By early afternoon, she had fleshed out her ideas into a compelling global strategy to catch consumers where they spent their free time. The kiosks to sell Stone Industries wearable technologies, pulse monitors, odometers, fitness watches, on-site at yoga studios was only the first niche she was proposing. She added in examples of other health and fitness environments it could be replicated in, reviewed the slides, then called it done with a satisfied nod. This was her chance to shine. She'd forced Jared's hand in allowing her to include her ideas. Now she had to make them worthy. Turning her face up to the sun, she allowed herself a bit of downtime until the men came back. Jared returned from Nice in his best mood of the week. He had bonded with David over their mutual love of art and managed to convince him that no, he was not dangling over the side of a cliff at Stone Industries with the board ready to cut him loose. He had also gone a long way to convincing him that there was little danger of long-term fallout from his manifesto with female consumers. People had short memories. Stone Industries would come out with its next big product and women would flock to it for its cool factor, as they always did. And all of this would be a blip on the radar of a soon-to-be successful partnership. The only thing that was messing with his superior mood was the email he'd gotten from his head of IT earlier this morning about the leak of his manifesto. It had literally stopped him in his tracks to discover, after a cyber chase of epic proportions, the email hack had been traced to the servers of Craig International, which could only mean that Michael Craig, one of his most vocal critics on the Stone Industries board, was behind it. He had meant to bury him at a time of weakness, and for that, he decided, mouth set, stomach hard, as he went outside in search of Bailey, he would pay richly. He had never liked or trusted Michael Craig, had never felt they were playing on the same team. He would use this opportunity to get rid of him. A growl escaped his throat as he headed toward the oceanside terrace. You didn't mess with a man's lifeblood. That was way, way over the line. He found Bailey on the terrace in a sun chair, laptop on her thighs, eyes closed, face turned up to the sun. David had gone on about how much he liked her on the drive to Nice. Not surprising after last night, but what had caught him off guard was that the collector of women, who'd lost his wife to illness at 45, had been focused not on Bailey's looks, but on her intelligence, her creativity. He loved her. That much was obvious. His mouth twisted as he surveyed her deceptively relaxed pose on the lounger, long legs kicked out in front of her. He had no doubt her mind was going a mile a minute under those closed lids, that she wasn't sleeping but strategizing, and a sour feeling tugged at his gut. He'd sidelined her, put her aside as a problem he didn't have time to deal with when it was his attraction to her that had been the issue all along. It wasn't like him to put the personal before business, and he hated that he had. She opened her eyes, the wariness he'd witnessed this morning making a reappearance. Did you have a good trip? I did. He sank into the chair opposite her and poured himself a glass of her mineral water. I owe you an apology. Her eyes rounded. For what? For underestimating you. For letting you languish in a role that was beneath you. She pushed herself up in the chair, her gaze meeting his. We haven't done the presentation yet. I've seen your ideas. He took a long swallow of the water and sat back, resting the glass on his thigh. I was wrong about you. I should have given you a voice. He lifted his shoulders. Maybe you were right last night. Maybe my judgment has been off. It's been a David and Goliath battle with the board. She pushed her finger into her cheek, a slow smile curving her lips. I think I'm just going to say thank you and leave it at that. Are you sure you're feeling all right? A wry smile edged his mouth. As a matter of fact, I am. You got me thinking last night, in a good way. A frown marred her brow. I might have been a bit harsh. He shrugged. I needed to hear it. I haven't had any time to think lately, and that's when I get myself into trouble. She pointed towards her computer screen. Want to see my slides? He nodded. I've heard Alexander is a stickler for detail. He likes to wade into the minutiae, a bit of a control freak. So I want to ensure all our ducks are in order. They went through the slides. He loved the way she'd laid them out, made a few suggestions of his own, and in a feat that could be classified as the eighth wonder of the world, they did a perfect run-through. Satisfied the presentation was as smooth and as flawless as it was going to get, he challenged Bailey to a tennis game. She wasn't half bad. What she lacked in skill, she made up for in determination, which seemed to be her modus operandi. She'd used the incredibly sharp brain she'd been born with, worked brutally hard, and taken herself places. He studied her as he waited for her to serve, concentration written across her face. Pictured her slugging it out at the local cafe, serving coffee all evening to put herself through school, selling 50 pairs of shoes a day at the local mall to secure her future, and he couldn't help but admire her. There was a lot of substance to Bailey St. John. Bailey was still on a high when she pulled on white capri jeans, a body-hugging tank, and a gauzy sheer blouse over it for their dinner at sea. Alexander Gagnon, Maison Electronique's Director of International Development and soon-to-be CEO, had flown in by helicopter while she'd been showering, the whir of the blades deafening as he touched down with two of Maison's other senior marketing staff. Tonight they would get to know the three executives over dinner on David's yacht, in a trip up the coast to Cannes. And tomorrow they would present their ideas to the group. Much more comfortable with the intimate choice of setting this evening, Bailey slipped on strappy, glittering sandals, spritzed on a headier perfume for nighttime, and met Jared outside his door. A slow smile curved his mouth when he opened it, denting his cheeks with those to-die-for almost dimples. You aren't going to let me pick your shoes? She resolutely ignored the sexy indentations. I had it under control tonight. His gaze swept over her, smooth and all-encompassing. You look like you're channeling Grace Kelly. She shifted her weight to the other foot. I'll take that as a compliment. The hand he placed at her back to ostensibly guide her down the hallway burned into her skin. Do that, he murmured, bending so his softly spoken words rasped across the sensitive skin behind her ear. He looked pretty gorgeous himself in casual black pants and a short-sleeved dark blue shirt that made the most of his eyes. But she'd keep that to herself. A small powerboat was waiting at the dock to take them out to the yacht. All the others were already on board, the crew member told them, firing the motor. Bailey took it all in, eyes wide. Growing up on a swamp in Florida, she'd been around boats her whole life. She'd seen the cruise ships lined up in Tampa when they'd visited the city. But that was a world away from this. David's yacht was at least 70 feet in length. They were about to cruise to Cannes during film festival time, and it frankly seemed unreal. As they neared the sleek yacht painted in the blue, white, and red colors of the French flag, the powerboat slowed to a crawl. They pulled alongside the yacht and were helped aboard by crew members. The rosy sky descended low over them, the lights of Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat twinkling from the shore as she stood looking back from the deck. It was glorious. David greeted them, then turned to introduce them to the three men beside him. She greeted the two marketing executives who had flown in from Paris, then Alexander Gagnon, a tall, distinguished male, with dark hair and cold-as-flint gray eyes. Her pulse flatlined as Alexander stepped forward. She teetered on her sandals and would have stumbled backward if Jared hadn't placed a hand on her back to steady her. It couldn't be. It could not be. Her gaze moved over him, hungry to prove herself wrong, but the cold, hard eyes that had studied her, eaten her up with an unflinching need to have her those nights in Vegas almost 10 years ago, were unmistakable. And he didn't miss a beat. "How lovely to meet you, Bailey," he murmured, taking her hand to brush a kiss across her knuckles. "Alexander Gagnon." Her breath constricted in her chest, a solid lump that threatened to choke her. She had never told him her real name, had never told any of the men she danced for her real name, and now he knew it. She registered the fact with the almost hysterical need to turn around, jump off the boat, and swim for shore. Whether her body actually turned in that direction, or whether Jared felt the shudder that went through her at the touch of Alexander Gagnon's lips on her skin, she wasn't sure. He released her for a moment to shake the other man's hand, then returned his palm to her back and kept it there. Alexander's gaze tracked the movement, then moved back to her face. "I'm looking forward to your presentation tomorrow," he drawled. "David has been telling me about your great ideas." Bailey's knees were shaking so hard she had to lean into Jared to keep herself upright. She felt his gaze hard on her, but kept hers focused straight ahead. Alexander was staring at her, waiting for a response. "Yes, well, she stumbled. "We're hoping you'll like them." "We know you'll love them," Jared corrected firmly, his palm pressing into her spine. Alexander's lips twisted in a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've spent some time in the States. David mentioned you did your MBA at Stanford," he said to Bailey. "Where did you do your undergrad?" He knew exactly where she'd done her undergrad. A fine sheen of perspiration broke out on her brow. Her voice dry, more gravelly than she'd ever heard it, she forced out, "At UNLV." He snapped his fingers. "That must be it. I feel we've met before, but I can't place it. I've entertained a lot of clients in Vegas." Every muscle in her body froze. The dark glitter in his eyes chilled her to the bone. "You must be mistaken," she rasped, finding her voice. "I'm quite sure we've never met." Gauntlet laid, she lifted her chin. Alexander inclined his head. "My mistake, then." She let out the breath she'd been holding, requested a martini for the pure, unadorned hit of alcohol it would provide. Jared leaned down to her. "What is wrong with you?" "I'm just not feeling quite right." His penetrating blue gaze ate through her. "A martini might not be the best thing, then. Let me get you some water." "I'm fine," she said sharply. "It's probably just the boat. I'll get over it." The martini helped. She sipped it, feeling the alcohol inject itself into her bloodstream, bite into the unreality gripping her. She had to find a way through this that didn't involve jumping off the boat and getting as far away from that man as she could. She had to pull herself together. But how? He had definitely recognized her. Her mind riffled through the options, desperately, not entirely clearly. She had to continue to pretend she'd never met him, treat him as if he was just a business acquaintance. But it was just her luck that Alexander was seated across from her at dinner, and the red shirt he had on made it impossible to forget the last time she'd seen him. She danced in her signature red lace dress and underwear as Kate Delaney that night at the Red Room, the highest-end strip club in Vegas, legendary for its beautiful women and sumptuous interiors. To wear red and dance last meant she was the owner's favorite, the most requested dancer of the week, which wasn't unusual for her. She pulled in a ton of regulars who came to see her cool, untouchable beauty uncovered, to watch the sensual, erotic transformation unfold. None of them could have known it was all an act for their benefit, that it was as far from the real Bailey as you could get. Alexander Gagnon had sat in the front row that night, as he had every night for the past 3. She'd felt his eyes on her, dark and unmoving. Despite the fact that there had been at least 150 other men in the club, she had only been conscious of him, of the tall, dark figure who had approached her each night to have a drink with him, and whom she'd turned down flat, despite the money he'd thrown at her, because there was something about the exquisitely dressed stranger with his $1,000 ties that said red light to her. That night she had retreated to the dressing room, strangely affected by the intensity of the experience. The magnitude of the tip Alexander had left her. Her fellow dancers had showered and dressed in a mad rush to hit the town. Since she'd just been heading home to study for an exam the next day, Bailey had taken her time, sat at her dressing table, and removed her thick, dramatic makeup. At some point, she'd looked up to find the tall, dark stranger standing inside the doorway. That all the other girls had gone. If you were to look past the dangerous edge of him that smoldered just below the surface, she would have called him inordinately handsome, distinguished. But all she could smell was the scent of her own fear as she got to her feet, heart pounding. "You can't be in here." He'd lifted a brow. "Bruno owes me one. He gave us 5 minutes. Her manager had let him in? Get out." He leaned back against the doorway, his gaze moving over her so slowly, so assessingly. She'd had to fight the urge to pull the edges of her blouse together. "After I give you my proposition, Kate." She should have walked to the door then and had him thrown out, but she'd been afraid of him. "You've rejected my requests to join me for a drink 3 nights in a row," he'd murmured, eyes glittering as he pushed away from the door and walked toward her. "I figured I'd try another strategy." She'd backed up until her behind was against the dressing table, trying hard not to show her fear. "I know you're a student, Kate. I'm offering you $50,000 for a night. Any hard limits, I'll respect them." She had stared at him, shocked that anyone would pay that much for a night with someone, shocked that that person would be her. She was the woman men shoved money at in a dirty, covetous thrill, not a high-priced escort. For a second, for one split second, it had crossed her mind that $50,000 would cover her tuition and living expenses for the year. She could spend the days going to school and studying like a normal student. She wouldn't have to be exhausted all the time, turning her nights and days upside down, snatching a couple of hours' study before she passed out at night. She could leave the back-breaking pain of her 4-inch heels behind, just like that. Then hot shame had flooded through her. How could she even be considering it? She'd pointed to the door. "Get the hell out of my dressing room." He just stood there. "Everyone has a price, Kate. Name it." "That's where you're wrong." She'd walked past him to the door and flung it open. "I don't." He must have seen the hatred burning in her eyes because he'd left. Afterward, Bruno had denied involvement, then had been fired a few weeks later for stealing money from the club. Alexander Gagnon had shown up for the next 2 nights to see if she'd changed her mind. It had been the hardest 2 nights of her working career, her ability to concentrate non-existent. "Bailey?" David was frowning, eyeing her plate. "You didn't enjoy your meal?" She looked up to see the waitstaff hovering by her side, ready to remove the seafood salad sitting practically untouched in front of her. "I'm so sorry," she murmured. "I'm just a little off." "Perhaps you got too much sun today," he suggested in French. "You are so fair." "Perhaps," she agreed. "I'm sure I'll be fine after a good night's sleep." Jared hadn't taken his eyes off her the entire meal. It could have been because she didn't seem able to add any intelligent insights to the conversation, or, alternatively, ask any valuable questions. Either way, it felt hard to breathe and she needed to escape. She excused herself and made a beeline for the ladies' room. It was downstairs off the opulent drawing room, done in royal blue marble with gold accents. She pulled in some deep breaths, splashed water on her ashen face, then pressed one of the thick, luxurious hand towels to her face. Could a nightmare actually come to life? Because this was hers. She applied some lipstick and pinched her cheeks to give them color, but she still looked deathly pale as she left her sanctuary and headed back upstairs. She had just stepped on deck when Alexander cut her off at the pass. "You've done well for yourself, Bailey." He leaned his arm on the railing and blocked the way back to the others. "Or should I say, Kate, what is your real name?" Bailey gave him a blank look, fighting to keep her composure. "I'm afraid I have no idea what you're talking about." "You think I don't remember you?" He rested his gaze on her face, as chilling and unnerving as it had been that night he'd sat in the audience watching her. "I remember every curve, every dip of your mind-blowing body, how you seduced every man in that room and left them begging for more." A fresh wave of perspiration broke out on her brow. "You have the wrong woman," she rasped, "and this is not at all appropriate." "I don't think I do." He pushed away from the railing and took the last couple of steps toward her. Bailey's heart knocked against her ribs. A cool Mediterranean breeze flitted over her, but she felt vaguely feverish. "I saw it on your face that night. You wanted to say yes." "I don't know you," she bit out, and started to brush by him. He curled his fingers around her arm and brought her to a halt. "They don't know, do they?" His smoky gaze heated with challenge. "You've moved on, gone to a great deal of trouble to put your past behind you." Yes, and she wasn't going back there now. "Get your hands off her, Gagnon." Jared's low, menacing command came from behind them. She twisted around and found him watching them, hands clenched by his sides, tall, lean body, coiled like a cat ready to pounce. Her heart zigzagged across her chest, threatening to explode right out of it. God, no, he couldn't know about this. Alexander lifted his hand from her arm and stepped back. "Cool your jets, Stone. We were just having a conversation." Jared took a step closer until he was toe-to-toe with Alexander. "I don't particularly like the nature of it, and neither does Bailey from the looks of it. So perhaps we should all return to the table for dessert." Alexander stared him down, just for the fun of it, Bailey guessed semi-hysterically. Her airways seemed closed to oxygen. Alexander lifted his hands in the air. "Beautiful, isn't she? Can't blame you. Ask her about the sexy mole on her hip, Stone. It's quite something. Or maybe you already know that." Bailey's heart sank into the deck. A trickle of perspiration rolled down her neck as Alexander turned and sauntered off. He had not just said that. Jared's gaze moved over her face. It was the stillness, the absolute stillness about him that got her. She shook her head, in full denial. "I don't know him," and that was true. She didn't know anything about him, except he was now the key player who would decide their fate in the biggest deal of her life, of Jared's life. Jared stepped closer to her. "Then why are you as white as a ghost? Why have you been off since the moment you saw him?" Her brain swirled in a desperate attempt to make this go away. Heart thumping painfully hard against her chest, she looked up at him. "He is an obnoxious jerk who has mistaken me for someone else. I am not good with boats, Jared, never have been, and I don't want to make it an issue for David, who has been kind enough to take us all on this lovely sail. So I think we should get back to the others before he worries." She brushed past him before he could stop her and headed back to the table where dessert was being served. Somehow, she managed to spoon a few mouthfuls of the undoubtedly delicious chocolate mousse into her mouth, but she tasted nothing. How could she when the world felt as if it was unraveling around her? Alexander's cool, unruffled composure across the table was utterly unnerving. As if they'd been trading old war stories rather than him throwing her past in her face. The night thankfully ended an hour later when David, she figured, took pity on her and suggested they do a final nightcap back at the villa. He insisted she rest rather than join them, and Bailey didn't protest. She brushed off Jared's intention to walk her to her room. "I'm fine." He came anyway, wearing a frown. "I'll be back to check on you," he said when they reached her room, planting a hand against the wall and looking her over. "Are you sure you're okay?" "I'm fine." She pressed a hand to her pounding head, which was making her feel distinctly nauseous now. "Don't bother. I'll be asleep." He stared her down. "I'll be back in half an hour." Bailey forced some painkillers down her throat with a glass of water and paced her beautiful, airy suite. The more she paced, the more her head pounded. The two lives she'd so carefully kept light years apart for so long had just crashed together with debilitating consequences. And the chances she was going to be able to keep them apart any longer were slim. Alexander Gagnon had offered her $50,000 to sleep with him almost 10 years ago, and now she had to face him, to pitch to him over a boardroom table. What if she had to work with him afterward? The trails of perspiration rolling down her nape made her feel hot, feverish. She had not spent years of her life building her reputation in the business world to let a man like Alexander Gagnon destroy it, to assume he knew what she was when she wasn't anything like that. "I remember every curve, every dip of your mind-blowing body, how you seduced every man in that room and left them begging for more," she remembered him saying. Alexander's words, cutting, accusatory, washed over her. Suddenly she felt dirty, so dirty. Hands shaking, she ripped off her jeans and tops, found her bathing suit, threw it on, and took the back stairs to the beach. The sea was dark and strewn with moonlight. The surf was up, eating into the sand with swift currents. She ignored how the darkness made it look dangerous, walked into it, and struck out to a place unknown, to a place where the past couldn't find her. Jared knocked on Bailey's door 45 minutes later. He'd nursed a final brandy with David and the others, fought the urge to put his fist through Alexander Gagnon's face, and ultimately restrained himself. He didn't believe Bailey for a second when she said she didn't know him. She'd had a violent reaction the minute she'd seen him. He'd felt it. They don't know, do they? You've moved on, gone to a great deal of trouble to put your past behind you. What had Gagnon been talking about? He knocked again on the door, his mouth tightening. Nothing. He waited 5 more seconds, knocked again, and turned the knob. The door was open, a table lamp flooding the drawing room with light. No Bailey. He strode across the room, pushed her bedroom door open, and saw the bed hadn't been touched. Her clothes were lying in a heap on the floor, which raised his antennae because Bailey was obsessively, compulsively neat. He walked out onto the floodlit terrace and found it empty. Scanning the grounds, he searched for her. On the beach below, a flash of white in the water caught his eye. Bailey's pale skin in the moonlight. There. He stripped off his shoes and socks and went after her. She was so far out in the waves he almost dived in fully clothed. But her pace was steady and her strokes sure, so he waded her out instead, his heels sinking into the sand. When she reached shore, she headed toward her towel, not 15 feet from him, but she didn't notice him at all. He allowed himself to enjoy the view while she toweled off. He'd had his fair share of women in his life. Some would say gone through them much more carelessly than a man should, but he'd never seen a woman looking so utterly goddess-like in a bathing suit. The spotlights on the beach rendered those never-ending legs of hers a work of art. The product of gently rolling hips, they were slim enough to look delicate, curved enough to be irresistible. His hungry gaze moved up, over her slim waist and more than ample chest, the perfection of which made his mouth go dry. She might not be a D-cup, but she was exquisite. She reached up and pulled her hair back into a ponytail, squeezing the water from it. It threw her delicate, unforgettable beauty into perfect spotlight. She looked untouchable, haunted. It reminded him why he was here. He started toward her. She bent over to dry her calves. Her mouth-watering backside was not something to be missed. The round, dark mark on the curve of her buttock wasn't either. He froze. It was unmistakably a mole Alexander Gagnon knew intimately enough to call out. He was across the sand and in her face so fast it made his own head spin. Bailey looked up, her pale face catching the moonlight. Her hands slapped the towel around her hips, but he was faster, spinning her around and pointing at the mark. "You lied to me," he snarled. "You don't know him, but he knows about intimate marks on your body? What exactly is going on?" She tried to twist out of his hold, but he was stronger, his fingers digging into her upper arms. Her eyes flashed dark, almost gray in the moonlight, contrasting with her chalk-white cheeks. "Get your hands off me, Jared, or are you no better than him?" He let her go then, fury singeing his nerve endings. "We are negotiating a deal worth tens of millions of dollars a year, Bailey. I want the truth, and I want it now." She took a step back, wrapped her arms around herself. "I told you the truth. I don't know him. I met him once when I lived in Vegas. He came on to me. I turned him down. That's it." "That's it?" He slapped his palms against his temples, biting out a curse. Seconds passed. 3, maybe 4. Then he pinned his gaze on her. "How did he know about the mole if you turned him down?" She went even paler. "There's nothing further you need to know that has anything to do with this deal." Her chin came up. "That's all I'm answering, and this conversation is done." His blood fired, raced in his veins, and he realized his fury had nothing to do with the deal. He wanted to know why that snake had an intimate knowledge of Bailey's behind. "I don't think so." He took a step closer, and this time she didn't back up. She stood her ground, eyes flashing. "You turn every man in Silicon Valley down. You act like you are untouchable, and yet that arrogant jerk, known for his womanizing, has had his hands on you. I don't get it." She stepped up to him, her heat fusing with his until they were in danger of a spontaneous combustion. "What's the matter, Jared? You can't stand that it wasn't you? That Mr. Manifesto has met his match?" He raked his gaze over her. "You know what, Bailey? You're right. I can't. Because if it had been me, you wouldn't have walked away." She opened those luscious lips of hers to say something not very nice. He kissed her before she made it there. And by God, she was the sweetest female he'd ever tasted. Hot, honeyed perfection he savored for about 2 seconds before she raised her hand to slap him. He caught it in his and slid his other hand behind her nape, tangling it in her wet hair. Changed the kiss into a persuasive, seductive assault on her senses, the kind that always, without fail, worked. Bailey wanted to fight, but somewhere along the way, somewhere along the edges of the soul-destroying assault Jared was laying on her, she found escape, needed it. When he cupped the back of her head and angled her to take the kiss deeper, she let him, moaned her approval when he brought his tongue into play and stroked her deeply. He smelled insanely good, and he tasted better, of cognac and expensive cigars, and she wanted more of him, a lot more. He muttered something under his breath, slid his hard thigh between her wet, shaking ones, and brought her closer. So close his heart pounded beneath her palm. His hand at her back dragged her against his chest, urged her softness against his hardness. Her cool, air-tightened nipples brushed against him through the fine material of his shirt, and the heat that flooded her core came hot and hard, like nothing she'd ever felt before. He cursed again and dragged his mouth down the column of her throat, pressing open-mouthed kisses against her damp skin. "Bailey," he breathed, "who is he to you?" Reality hit her like the hard slap of the night waves to her face. He wasn't kissing her because he wanted her. He was kissing her because he wanted to possess her, just like all the others. She sank a palm into his chest and pushed. Caught off guard, he stumbled backwards. His gaze flew to hers. "What the—" "You are all dogs," she hissed, legs spread wide, feet planted in the sand, "fighting over what you want, what you think is yours." He gave her wild-eyed look a wary glance. "You were as into that kiss as I was." Her elegant blonde brows came together. "And now I'm walking away. Again. You were wrong, Jared. You aren't any different than the rest of them. You're all the same." She left him standing there, staring after her, his jaw practically on the ground. Why was she always thinking Jared was different when he so categorically wasn't? Maybe she was the one losing her sense of judgment. And so ends Chapter 4. I hope you enjoyed this reading. I will be continuing in a few days. So keep an eye out for the drill and read of Chapter 5 of the Magnate's Manifesto. Until then, thank you for sticking with me throughout this reading. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave me comments down below, and do come back and visit with me again soon. Bye-bye for now.